Now, welcome everyone, particularly welcome students. My name is Santa Arias, and I am the head of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and I am thrilled to be part of the College of Humanities, and I am thrilled to be here tonight with this wonderful panel of colleagues that are going to be discussing, and the title of the evening of the presentation is Transformation, Story, Character, and Meaning Across Time and Space. We would like to start today by saying that we respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being the home to the Odam and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign nations, Native nations, and indigenous communities through education, offerings, partnerships, and community service. We also want to emphasize that this land acknowledgement is a milestone in our ongoing dialogue with the Tohono O'odham, the Pascua Yaqui, and the 20 other federally recognized tribes in the state. It is an indicator of our commitment to collaboration and to maintaining government-to-government relationships with the Native nations and indigenous communities with whom we share this region. Thanks for joining us at the 12th annual Tucson Humanities Festival, which we started as Humanities Week. However, through community outreach, engagement, and incredible speakers, it has grown to a month-long series of thought-provoking presentations during the month of October each year to celebrate the National Arts and Humanities Month. This year, the theme is storytelling. I would like to acknowledge our sponsors who helped make tonight's event and the festival possible: the Arizona Humanities, Dorrance Foundation, Humanities Seminar Programs, Bookman's Entertainment Exchange. We are excited to offer tonight's presentation to a wide audience at home through live stream and captioning provided by the town of Oro Valley. For those watching live, if you have questions that you would like to ask the panelists, uh, please find the link on the Humanities Festival homepage. For those of you that are attending in person, please use the QR codes posted throughout the seating area to submit the questions. Because of COVID, we will not be passing a microphone tonight during the Q&A. And I am pleased to introduce the panelists. The first one I would like to introduce is Jennifer Lynn Donahue. She is an associate professor of practice with the Africana Studies program. Dr. Donahue specializes in Caribbean literature with an expertise on the relationship between narrative, drama, and sexual politics. Her teaching and research interests include Caribbean and postcolonial literature, Anglophone African literature, and women's and gender studies. Her work has appeared in a number of journals, including a review of international English literature, the Journal of Commonwealth Literature, Studies in Gothic Fiction, and Restoration and 18th Century Theater Research. Dr. Donahue is currently working on a book-length study of the intersection of medicine, race, and empire in early Caribbean writing. The second panelist is Faith Harden. She is She's an associate professor in my department, Spanish and Portuguese, and she's affiliated to the faculty in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and the program of Social, Cultural, and Critical Theory, as well with the American Literary Translator Associations at the University of Arizona. Dr. Harden research and teaching center on the literary, cultural, and intellectual history of early modern transatlantic Spain, particularly the picaresque novel, autobiographical fiction, and life writing, and the work of women playwrights and poets. She has recently published her first book, Arms and Letters, Military Life Writing in Early Modern Spain, published by Toronto. The book explores gender representations of honor, violence, and literary self-fashioning in 16th and 17th century soldiers' memoirs. Faith Harden is currently at work on 3 different projects, a special issue of the journal Humanista on literary lives in the medieval and early modern Iberian world, an English translation of the picaresque novel Estebanillo Gonzalez, and a monograph on the literary and cultural significance of animal imagery in peninsular and colonial Spanish texts. Thirdly, Kaoru Hayashi is an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Studies. Dr. Hayashi is a scholar of pre-modern Japanese literature, specializing in classical tales. Her areas of research interest also include pre-modern Japanese history and religious studies and modern film and mass media. Her book project, Mediating Spirits, explores the invocation of the angry dead, both as a social practice of genealogical imagination, repeatedly thematized within pre-modern Japanese literary texts, as an act whose structure generated a narrative voice integral to the development of classical Japanese narratives. And then Arum Park is an assistant professor in the classics department. Arum Park has been at the University of Arizona since 2015. She has published articles and book chapters on archaic and classical Greek poetry, the Greek novel, Augustan poetry, as well as public-facing pieces on Me Too in Greco-Roman literature, race and diversity in classics and classical reception. Her interests include gender, truth, pastoralism, intertextuality, and race and ethnicity in Greek and Roman literature, and she regularly teaches courses in Greek language and mythology. She's the daughter of Korean immigrants. She currently co-chairs the Asian American Classical Caucus. And Aaron starts tonight's event.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the introduction. Advance this. Oh, I can see. Okay. All right. So my talk tonight is called The Transformation of a Classic, specifically Homer's Odyssey. So the story of Homer's Odyssey, a Greek epic from the 8th century BC, is well known. The hero Odysseus has been away from home for 20 years, 10 at war, followed by a 10-year journey back. In his struggles to make it home, he encounters a number of fantastical and dangerous things, including a cyclops, a blind prophet, sirens who lure sailors to their death with their irresistible song, all in an effort to get back to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. In his long absence, numerous men have taken up residence in his home, vying to marry Penelope for the wealth and power she represents. These men are disrespectful and dangerous, carrying with them an ever-present looming threat of violence. Many of the enslaved women of the household have taken up with these men, throwing in their lot with them amidst the chaos that consumes Odysseus' home while he is gone. Upon his return, Odysseus and Telemachus kill the suitors, and Odysseus also orders his son to kill the enslaved women who had taken up with them. Telemachus obeys brutally and even gleefully. This is a striking and disturbing moment in the Odyssey, haunting for its vivid cruelty. And I'll just read an excerpt from the Odyssey that talks about that passage, talks about that event. Telemachus took a cable which had seen service on a blue-bowed ship, made one end fast to a high column in the portico, and threw the other over the roundhouse, high up, so that their feet would not touch the ground. As when long-winged thrushes or doves get entangled in a snare, so the women's heads were held fast in a row, with nooses round their necks to bring them to the most pitiable end. For a little while their feet twitched, but not for very long. Obviously a really memorable passage, but it's not, for whatever reason, the most famous moment of the Odyssey, if we are to judge by the way the Odyssey is remembered in its many retellings and adaptations over the centuries. What usually makes it into these transformations of Odysseus' story is his journey. Apollonius' Argonautica, for example, a Greek epic poem from the 3rd century BC, adapts many bits of Odysseus' journey in the quest of Jason and the Argonauts to obtain the golden fleece from a faraway land. During their journey, the Argonauts face many of the trials and tribulations Homer's Odysseus does. Virgil's Aeneid, a Roman epic of the 1st century BC, does a similar thing, telling of Aeneas and his men's escape from Troy and their long and arduous journey in search of a new homeland. There have also been many modern retellings of Odysseus' story, many of which similarly focus on the journey. So a fun example, this is one that all classicists love, is the Coen brothers' 2000 film, O Brother, Where Art Thou?, which tells of a character named Ulysses, the Latin name of Odysseus, who escapes from prison to try to make his way back to his wife Penelope. On the way, he encounters a one-eyed man, played by John Goodman, right? A cyclops, a blind prophetic figure, and some women singing an irresistible song, luring men into the water, the sirens. The book and film Big Fish does a similar thing, focusing on the adventures and travels of a young man who eventually finds his way to the woman he loves. And the author of this book explicitly says he's modeling it after the Odyssey. But more recently, there's been a significant shift in the kinds of transformations the Odyssey has undergone. Specifically, female perspectives have been foregrounded, resulting in a number of really interesting and fresh ways of understanding the story of the Odyssey. One example is Margaret Atwood's 2005 novel, The Penelopiad, which retells the Odyssey through the perspective of Penelope, the wife who long awaits the return of her husband. We also hear from the enslaved women slaughtered by Telemachus. And you can imagine the story looks very different from Penelope's and the slaughtered women's eyes. This entire novel brings out the point that there are different types of female experience in the Odyssey that we may not have considered were it not for Atwood's focus on these characters. Through her retelling, these female characters, who are always present in the Odyssey but in the background, come to the foreground, giving us new prisms through which to view an old story. Madeline Miller's more recent 2018 novel, Circe, does a similar thing, focusing on a witch that Odysseus encounters on his journey, but telling us her story, rather, and how it intersects with his from her point of view. Full disclosure, I've not finished reading this book yet, but I do look forward to experiencing the rest of Circe's story through her eyes and not just Odysseus's. The last transformation I'd like to talk about is Emily Wilson's 2017 translation of the Odyssey. the first English translation published by a woman. There are a lot of things I would like to say about this one, but I'll focus on just one key detail that Dr. Wilson points out in many of the interviews she did to publicize this translation. In the section that I mentioned before, where Odysseus orders Telemachus to kill the enslaved women, Telemachus punctuates their violent and cruel slaughter with some vivid words. This is a moment rife with misogyny, clearly, but the male translators who came before Emily Wilson injected it with even more misogyny than was actually in the Greek text. On the left, I'm showing you Robert Fagel's translation, which in the section I highlight uses, as you can see, some choice language to translate what Telemachus says about these women. On the right, Emily Wilson's translation, which corrects previous mistranslations, staying true to the Greek, but still conveying Telemachus' disdain for these women. What I like about these transformations, ancient and modern, is that they have the potential to illuminate an old story, helping us to see things in the Odyssey that we might have missed, but were always there, lying beneath the surface, waiting for the right transformation that will bring them to light. As a classicist who by definition studies the ancient past, I find these transformations exciting because they remind us that old does not mean static or self-evident. We can and do still learn new things about the past, even when lots of people have studied it before us, because our current and future moments will always bring us new ways of looking at old things. Thank you. I'm instructed to tell you about this QR code again, so if you have any questions for me or the other panelists, please remember to use this QR code, which are posted throughout the seating area to submit your questions, which we'll answer during the Q&A that will follow Jennifer's presentation at the end. If you are watching live, please find the link on the Humanities Festival homepage to submit your question through. And our next speaker will be Kaoru.
Thank you for the introduction. So my name is, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and excited about joining this great opportunity. Can you hear me okay back there? Okay, thank you. Okay, so my name is Kaoru Hayashi, and then my area of specialty is pre-modern Japanese literature, and especially focusing on narrative and then the monsters and then ghosts. So today I'd like to talk about transformation, focusing on the monster from early Japan and beyond, paying particular attention to this one called the spider. So one of the oldest monster in Japan, first recorded in the early 8th century. So many of us enjoy the story of heroes and how they defeat villains, oftentimes in the form of monsters. So, but when we see such monstrous figures in a story or film or art or manga and anime, we usually able to identify who the heroes and who the monsters or villains are. So although contemporary story and especially TV drama makes the distinction of villains and the heroes a bit broad and more complicated, we tend to expect those deviant and scary looking figure to be monster based on how we were trained to think about good versus evil, or heroes versus monsters, and normal versus abnormal, us versus them. So such distinction have been repeatedly told and retold and imagined and reimagined in the form of stories and art throughout history. Today, I would like to introduce you to dark spiders, the first depicted in the oldest extant Japanese text, one of the oldest extant Japanese text, written in 720 CE. The text is entitled The Chronicle of Japan, and this is the official historical record decreed by the imperial court. So historical record sounds a bit boring, but this text actually includes so much fascinating storytelling. So through the story of this monster, I want us to explore four particular aspects to reconsider the concept of transformation. So first, transforming enemies into non-human monsters. Second, transforming history through the storytelling. The third, transforming modern enemies into the monstrous others. And finally, the monster's own transformation and escape from history. So by focusing on this point, I hope that we can transform a little bit of our understanding of heroes and villains and the meaning of monster. So the Chronicle of Japan begins with the Japanese creation myth, explain the origin of the world and the imperial family's divine ancestry and their rule down to the 8th century. So today's story is about one of the legendary emperor, Emperor Jinmu, who supposedly established the country of Yamato, or early name of Japan, in the Japanese archipelago. The Chronicle of Japan tells of how he pacified the many monstrous creatures, settled dispute between tribes, and then restored the peace to the archipelago. This is a chapter, the passage about his eastern expedition of the Emperor Jinmu, and I quote, "When Emperor Jinmu reached the age of 45, he said, 'Our imperial ancestor and imperial parent, like God, like sages, accumulated happiness and amassed glory. Many years elapsed from the date when our heavenly ancestor descended until now. But the remote region do not yet enjoy the blessing of imperial rule. So every town has always been allowed to have its lord and every village its chief, who each one for himself makes a division of territory and practices mutual aggression and conflict. I think that the land will undoubtedly be suitable for the extension of the heavenly task so that its glory should fill the universe," end quote. So this Emperor Jinmu went on to the remote area where there were a lot of conflict and chaos to save the world, foster justice, and the best of the peace. So in the process, he encounters monsters called Tsuchigumo, or dark spider. And I quote, the emperor commanded his general to exercise a troop. At this time, there were Tsuchigumo, that spider, in 3 places. All refused to present themselves at court. The emperor therefore sent a detachment to put them all to death. There were moreover that spider at the village of Takaohori, whose appearance was as follows. They had short bodies and long arms and legs. They were of the same class as pygmies. The imperial troop wove nets which they flung over them and then threw them, end quote. So this dark spider's appearance was recorded, that they have short bodies and then long arms and a leg, and also looks like pygmies. So it is actually a little bit difficult to imagine what they were. So various later Japanese artists and literary try to imagine and depict these dark spiders and the story of this hero, Emperor Jinmu, defeating and conquering these monsters. So this story was repeatedly told and retold. Here you can see some depiction of the spider's monster with long leg and the arm. This black and white image is slightly difficult to see, but you can see the spiders hiding actually. Oh, sorry. Hiding in the cave like here. So these images actually do not exactly capture one of the most important characteristic of that spider, which the original text clearly describe as pygmy-like. So, but contrary to these spider monster figures and the story that the later people reinvented, in fact, the dart spider were originally not spider or not monster at all. In ancient Japan, the term tsuchigumo or dart spider was used as a derogatory term for Aborigine or the different tribes and the rebels who fought against emperors Jimmu and imperial court's army. So the imperial court called those who did not surrender to the emperor Jimmu dart spider. But we can see how later artists and storytellers transform such people into this non-human or more animal-like figure and monster. So this is my kind of second conclusion for today, how the story of that spiders representing demonized figure of the imperial enemy who lived on the peripheries, who was told and then retold to justify the imperial court's military campaigns and kept as an official history of Japan. But this idea of turning enemies or the unknown into the inhuman monster or beast is not limited to the early Japan. As you can see these images, we see animal-like figures or inhuman figure or some masks constantly on the TV or film and many images. So in so many ways, these animal-like images helped viewer to easily identify monster or bad guy. But I want to show a few more specific examples that were used during World War II. So these are war propaganda posters from Japan, Italy, and Germany that turned the US soldier into monster. So the monstrous figures are not necessarily this one. These are animals or giant bugs, but are clearly depicted to be frightening or different from normal humans. So the Japanese poster, like this one, the left one, depicts one of the most popular demon figures in Japan, but here you can see that they are actually wearing American British flag diapers. Of course, the US also transformed their enemies into monsters, villains. So these are the image of kind of devilish and monstrous Japanese and German enemies. But these images are indeed a bit more subtle, but it is a very dangerous phenomenon to create and encourage stereotypes of group of people, which, as we know, very difficult to break. So although my primary interest is in pre-modern Japanese monsters and how the authority transform their enemy into those monsters, this kind of transformation is still very relevant to today's society. So, but as a monster ghost lover, I want to end this talk with a bit more fun about those monsters and their transformation. So the 8th century historical story of the dart spider have become inspiration for many variant stories and later time. So here it is a no theater rendition of the dart spider story that has been performed since around 15th century. So around the 17th and 18th century, as woodblock prints and the book become much more popular, beloved story of the dart spiders were adapted by many Japanese writers and became one of the most well-known monster figures in Japan. Ironically though, in this adaptation, the hero figures however, no longer the Emperor Jinmu, but this other samurai, kind of samurai warrior guy, Lord Minamoto Yorimitsu, who features in many other legends and stories. So interestingly, the Dark Spider kind of escaped from original concept and transformed themselves in the popular culture. So, and the Dark Spider is actually very popular today. So you might have heard this Japanese anime. It's called Yokai Monster Watch. And apparently this character is called Dark Spider, Tsuchigumo. And there are many people who cosplay as this monster today worldwide. So the Dark Spider, Tsuchigumo, outlived and they became more popular than the imperial heroes, imperial house hero and Emperor Jinmu. So once again, while it is very important to keep in mind that the danger of demonizing enemy as a monster, such monster can escape our original intentions and undergo popular transformation of their own. So thank you very much. Okay. I think I should remind you that if you have any question for me or other panelists, please remember to use the QR code posted throughout the seating area to submit a question, which we'll answer during Q&A session. And then we'll Q&A session that after Dr. Jennifer Donahue's presentation. If you are watching live, please find the link on Humanities Festival homepage to submit your question. Okay. So next up, our speaker is Dr. Faith Harden.
Thank you. Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? No? Okay, I probably have to move it down. Is this better? Yeah? Okay. All right, well, welcome. Thank you guys for coming. The tale of transformation that I want to share with you tonight revolves around the extraordinary life story of a real historical person, Catalina or Antonio de Erauso, sometimes known as the Lieutenant Nun or la Monja Alferez. So Erauso lived in the first half of the 17th century. Born a woman in Spain, she died as a veteran soldier in Mexico. Sorry, I feel like I'm in a concert. Born a woman in Spain, Erauso died as a veteran soldier in Mexico after successfully petitioning the King of Spain for a military pension and the Pope for a special dispensation to dress and to live as a man. Now, a multitude of documents attest not only to the existence of Erauso, but also to the celebrity status that she acquired in her lifetime. Probably the most important of these documents is the first-person autobiographical narrative attributed to her, titled The Life of the Lieutenant Nun, Catalina de Erauso, which was originally composed around 1626. So, on your left, we see the portrait painted by the artist Juan van der Hamen. It was part of a collection of portraits that he made of celebrated literary and intellectual figures that hung around the court of King Philip IV. The facial features and imposing demeanor of this picture echo the physical description of Erauso written by the traveler Pedro del Valle in a letter he composed after meeting the famous Lieutenant Nun when she returned to Madrid to petition the king. So both that portrait, the royal petition, and the description that I'll read you in just a second are from around the same time. So Pedro del Valle writes, Erauso is tall and sturdy, very manly, with more of the swashbuckling air of the soldier than the gallant carriage of a courtier. Only her hands could cause you to doubt her masculine sex. They are full and fleshy, although strong. Yet in her demeanor, still, sometimes there's an air of something feminine. So on the far right here, you see two busts of Erauso. They're both based on this van der Hamen portrait, and they both echo Pedro del Valle's description. The top one is a monument in San Sebastián in Spain, And the bottom one is from Orizaba in the state of Veracruz in Mexico, which is where Erauso lived as a mule driver until her death in 1650. And in the middle image, we have a really glamorous image of a film still from the 1944 Mexican movie starring the famous Mexican actress Maria Felix. And here, she kind of plays the Lieutenant Nun as a sexy tomboy. Very different from how the autobiography will portray her. So in addition to the Vanderhamen portrait, the letters, news reports, and Erauso's official petitions, the reputation of the Lieutenant Nun undoubtedly rested and continues to rest on her autobiography. So in this presentation, I'll focus on that text, her autobiography, and the sexual transformation that it textualizes. But I wanted to mention in passing, for those who might be interested, there have been many discursive transformations of Erauso's life story. Erauso's tale has taken many different media forms, including a 17th century play, multiple movies, and at least one comic book. And each of these media forms, of course, is constituted by certain generic conventions, which in turn shape Erauso's tale. For example, in both the 17th century play and then the mid-century Mexican movie, Erauso is essentially domesticated. Antonio turns back into Catalina, and she is assured a happy ending in a conventional heterosexual marriage. And the autobiography, as we'll see, has a much different ending. Now, the original text of the autobiography, The Life of the Lieutenant Nun, is actually yet to be found. There's a record of the manuscript being deposited at a printer's office in Seville, again in 1626, the year that Erauso briefly returned to the Americas to make her royal petition. But the earliest extant copies are 3 manuscript or hand-lettered copies, probably produced by the same person between 1693 and 1701, so some 75 years after she wrote this original. Each of these 3 copies, which are labeled A, B, and C, is somewhat different. The B copy was never finished, so I'll just focus on variants A and C and a few of the key differences between them. And we can kind of think of them as drafts, right? Different drafts of this manuscript. As we'll see, although the variations between A and C are relatively minor, because they're related to the sexual transformation at the center of Erauso's story, they affect significant shifts in meaning. So both the A and C copies of the autobiography kind of begin in the same way, describing in a few paragraphs Erauso's birth, education, and reinvention, and I'll briefly gloss that here. Erauso was born into a noble military family, and like most daughters of the nobility, she was sent to be educated in a convent from a very early age. When she was around 14, she had a violent encounter with an older nun. She plotted her escape. She stole the iron ring of keys from the prioress, who happened to be her aunt, and went unlocking door after door of the nunnery until she finally found herself outside. It was midnight, and she stole away to a nearby hillside where she spent 3 days and 3 nights in a miraculous metamorphosis. From her skirt, she fashioned a pair of pants. From her underclothes, she made a man's shirt and stockings. She also cut her hair and scattered it around the mountainside as a way of covering her tracks. The only item that escaped her knife was her nun's habit, about which she states, "I left it there on the ground, untouched, because it was useless to me." So this first scene is not only a scene of gendered transformation, it's also a scene of class transformation, as Erauso sheds the costly habit of an upper-class convent and makes her clothing into that of a simple servant boy. From this point on, she will become he. And the autobiography actually uses alternating masculine and feminine pronouns, and so I'll do the same. Now, in the guise of a servant boy, Erauso is able to attain a certain level of freedom, working for many masters, acquiring various skills, and leaving each post as soon as he grows bored. He eventually finds himself on a ship bound for what's now Panama, an important node in the Spanish colonial network of expropriation, extraction, commerce. In Panama, Erauso works as a merchant's apprentice, In his free time, he frequents the theater, the gambling halls, and the salons of his master's attractive young daughters. The autobiography describes him as a young tough, spoiling for a fight. When attacked, either physically or verbally, he responds with vicious accuracy. He's also described as something of a ladies' man. Practically every woman that Arauso encounters finds him terribly attractive. A couple even propose marriage, a trap that Arauso avoids by simply leaving town. After a string of dangerous flirtations and homicidal street fights, having served as both a merchant and a soldier, traversing thousands of miles along the western coast of South America, Arauso is finally caught. With no possibility of escape, he confesses. And here, towards the end of the autobiography, we have a scene that registers both sexual and textual transformation. And I'll quote this scene from Steptoe's translation, which is based on the C variant, or the later variant of the manuscript. Senor, and here she's addressing the bishop of Huamanga in Chile in this confession. She says, "Sir, I am a woman. I was raised in a convent but left before I took my vows. I went to such and such a place, undressed myself, dressed myself up again, cut my hair, traveled here and there, embarked, disembarked, hustled, killed, maimed, wreaked havoc, and roamed about until coming to a stop in this very instant at the feet of your eminence." And in this moment, Antonio reverts to Catalina. And here's where the A and C variants of the manuscript differ. In the A variant, the earlier version, it's Catalina herself who invites the bishop to bring in two matrons or midwives, experts in women's health, to examine her. And critically, this happens before Arauso is invited to confess. Only after these midwives certify her sex and virginity is Arauso permitted to speak. In other words, in the A variant, virginity is the precondition for being considered a trustworthy female subject. In the C variant, the later version, the midwives are described as being accompanied by a doctor and two surgeon barbers, as if the testimony of female healers had to be further corroborated by male experts. And in fact, this reflects a broader trend towards the beginning of the 18th century as university-trained doctors began to assert preeminence over traditional, often female, practitioners in the realm of women's health. In the C variant, Arauso's examination occurs after her confession. Rather than the precondition for speaking, the genital examination becomes the narrative climax of this scene. It's the biological evidence that definitively closes the case. In both variants, Arauso's virginity is ratified, and once her convent certifies that she had never in fact taken any vows, she's able to successfully argue for a pension and a papal dispensation. In other words, she or he is free. The final scene of the autobiography draws a picture of this freedom, again with slight variance in the A and C versions. So this is the unsettling ending from the A variant in my translation. One day, strolling along the dock in Naples, I saw two women chatting with two men. One of the women, thinking she was being witty, called out to me, "And where are you going, Senora Catalina?" To which I responded, "You lie like a whore. Anyone who wants to defend your honor can find me right here." And I pulled out my sword and dagger, and I attacked the men with the flat of my blade, and they ran away. Just imagine him doing it, right? And turning back to the women, I slapped and kicked them, and I was even tempted. And here she uses the feminine form, curiously, estuve tentada. I was tempted to cut their faces. So the text ends there on a cliffhanger that's also a paradox. In addition to the gendered application of violence, where the men are hit with the sword, the women are hit with hands and feet, the return to the feminine form in this last sentence is curious. Estuve tentada, I was tempted. Even as Arauso calls the Neapolitan woman a liar for referring to him as senora or madam, and corrects the record by ostentatiously wielding the masculine privilege of public violence, and telling the scene and recounting the temptation to inflict further punishment, he is a she. And in contrast, here is the C variant, and I'll end here. Remembering that the C variant is the later, more polished version. In this version, the threat, the real violence is reduced to a mere threat. and it maintains a neutral aspect by eliding the use of gendered forms. And this is Steptoe's translation. And one day in Naples, as I was strolling about the wharves, I was struck with the tittering laughter of two ladies who leaned against a wall, making conversation with two young bucks. They looked at me, and I looked at them, and one said, "Senora Catalina, where are you going all by yourself?" "My dear harlots," I replied, "I have come to deliver 100 strokes to your pretty little necks and 100 gashes with this blade to the fool who would defend your honor." The women fell dead silent, and then they hurried off. This is also an abrupt ending, but in some sense, perhaps a happier one, right? It also successfully counters the threat verbally rather than with physical violence. His reputation is by now such that he can continue to live in relative peace by merely threatening to violently defend his honor. And so in this final scene, in the C variant, the reader can envision Erauso striding away across the Neapolitan docks and off into the pages and stages of the histories, plays, films, and other media forms that would carry his, her, their story across time. Thank you. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions for me or any of the panelists, remember to use the QR codes posted throughout the seating area, and we'll answer your questions following Jennifer's presentation. And if you're watching live, please find the link on Humanities Festival homepage to submit your question through. And next up is Jennifer Donahue.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. All right. So tonight I am sharing one legend of I'm sharing one version of the legend of a woman named Annie Palmer. She's from Jamaica. Don't know if anybody has been to Jamaica. If so, you've been to Montego Bay. You may have driven past her home. And here is an image of Annie Palmer. So, since the publication of James Costello's pamphlet in 1868, fact and fiction have melded in the tale of the 18th century Jamaican plantation owner named Annie Palmer. Palmer, who died in 1831, achieved legendary status as a result of her alleged practice of obeah, relations with men, and murder of her husbands. The tale that I will share today is written by Diane Brown, an award-winning Jamaican children's author. Her text, adapted for a younger audience, was published in 1980 in a Jamaican primary school reader. Brown's version is honest in that it is one of these stories. That is, Brown does not profess to share the legend of Annie Palmer, but rather one of the versions of it. In stressing that she is retelling a version of the story, Brown recognizes how the tale has morphed over the years. But before we begin, I would like to share that there are terms and moments in Brown's work that may be activating or could make you uncomfortable. But with that being said, my goal tonight is to center her work, and so I will read directly from her text. And the images you see are from the short story that's presented to, I guess what would be our equivalent of third grade children, so maybe roughly 7 or 8 years old. And this is the first page. Her story is entitled The White Witch of Rose Hall. Annie Palmer was an English woman. She lived in the time of slavery on a big plantation called Rose Hall near Montego Bay. There are many different stories about Annie Palmer. We do not know if all of them are true, but they all tell us that she was a very wicked woman. She was called the White Witch of Rose Hall. Here is one of the stories. When Annie was a young girl, she was very beautiful. A rich English planter named John Palmer took her for his wife, and they went to live in his great house at Rose Hall, depicted here. At that time, Rose Hall was one of the richest and most beautiful great houses in Jamaica. The master had a lot of money, and he liked to spend it on nice things and on big parties and dances. John Palmer thought he was very lucky because he had everything he wanted. He had a large plantation with many slaves. He had a beautiful great house, and he had a lovely young wife. But he was not lucky. Annie Palmer was beautiful, but she was a selfish and cruel woman. After a time, she got tired of her life with John Palmer. She made up her mind to get rid of him. Every night, John Palmer had a drink after his dinner. One night, after his drink, he suddenly had a strange, sick feeling. He called for his wife and begged her to help him. She knew he would die because she put poison in his drink. Annie Palmer watched him die, and then she laughed. The other English planters did not know how John Palmer died. Annie pretended to be very sad, and she told them that he had died from fever. They believed her. Many people died from fever in those days. Only the slaves knew what had happened in the great house. They knew that John Palmer had died from poison, but they were afraid to tell anybody. After that, Annie Palmer lived alone in Rose Hall. She used to bring different men to come and spend time with her. Some of them were slaves. Others were Englishmen who came to work on the plantation, but she got tired of them all. Sometimes, when she got tired of them, she played cruel tricks on them. She even poisoned some of them. She always said they died of fever. The slaves, who knew the truth, could not do anything. They were afraid of Annie Palmer because she was so cruel to them. She had prisons under the house where she beat them. Sometimes she beat them till they died. No other slave master was as cruel as she was. But that was not the only thing that frightened the slaves. They believed that she could work magic and send duppies to frighten people. Annie Palmer used to ride around her plantation at nights. Because of this, the slaves said it was dangerous to go out at night. Some slaves said they saw terrible things after she had been riding by. They saw duppies and strange, ugly devils. They were afraid even to talk about the things they saw. The slaves would hide in their houses at nights when they heard Annie Palmer coming. They said she was dangerous, and they called her a witch and a devil. Then one day, a new Englishman came to work on the plantation. Annie Palmer fell in love with him, but he did not love her. She did everything she could to make him love her, but he loved a pretty young slave girl. When Annie Palmer heard of this, she hated the slave girl. She was even more cruel to the slaves because she could not get what she wanted. Then the pretty slave girl got sick. Nobody knew what was wrong with her, and nothing could make her better. The slaves believed that Annie Palmer had worked some magic to make the girl sick. There was an old slave who could work obeah, but not even he could do anything to help the girl. Soon, she was dead. The slaves were even more afraid of Annie Palmer now. They asked the old slave to use his obeah to help them kill Annie Palmer. They made up their minds to put poison in her drink. But Annie took one look at her drink and knew that something was wrong. She soon found out that there was poison in it. The news spread across the plantation. "We cannot kill her," the slave said. "Her power is stronger than obeah. That wicked devil will not stop until she finds out who tried to poison her." The slaves all over the plantation were afraid. They were afraid even to look at her as she rode by. Her long black hair blew in the wind, and her dark eyes flashed a dangerous fire. Then one morning, Annie Palmer was found dead. She had not been poisoned. She had been strangled. Nobody knew who had strangled her. Some people believed that it was one of the men who was spending time with her. Others said she was strangled by the slaves and the old obeah man. Nobody ever found out. She was so wicked that people said she could not be buried in the churchyard. They had to bury her on Rose Hall Plantation. All this happened many years ago. Today, Rose Hall Great House is a beautiful place again. Many of the walls had fallen down because nobody was looking after it, but the house has been rebuilt. It looks very much as it did when Annie Palmer lived there. Many of the things inside are just like the things people used in those days. Visitors can go and see it and hear the story of Annie Palmer. So before I move to a couple of my points, I wanted to share some reflections from the author. I had the great pleasure of communicating with her over email, and she was really gracious in reflecting on the tale because it's been, I guess, about 40 years since she wrote this. And she wanted me to stress that this was the first project of its kind undertaken in Jamaica. We have to remember that Jamaica was a British colony, so even in 1980, the textbooks were still heavily influenced by the British curriculum. So Brown was a part of a small team, I think it was 4 to 6 writers, she said, who went into the schools and met the Jamaican children. And I'll read from her email. She said, I remember we went into the primary schools to familiarize ourselves with the target audience, with the children. The children were astonished to meet Jamaican writers. They thought all writers were foreigners or dead. This series set the stage for celebrating our identity. And I mean, how beautiful, and even to think about the effect of the children to see people and to see their stories in print. So Brown was really proud of that and wanted me to share that with you. And I asked her what she would do differently if she were to present this material today, because we're in a very different context, of course. And she said that she may have changed the word obia, and she may have instead referred to that person as an African religious leader to honor that legalization of obia that's happened. But she said that the children at the time certainly would have understood what that term means, and that children today, especially children from rural areas, would know what that means. And then secondly, she said that, quote, reading the story again, it seems quite graphically violent. And I'm not sure if it landed as such for you, and we can talk about that. And she said, however, the time of slavery was a violent time, and there's no escaping that. And she talked to me a little bit about her role as a gatekeeper. And over the years, she's come to internalize this role of a gatekeeper in telling stories, and in the context, of course, for that. So before we move to the Q&A, I just wanted to offer a couple of points that I think we could focus on. So one is social norms, and I think it's really interesting across all of our stories to think about folklore as communicating norms, and in this case, norms to very young children. So across all of the iterations of the tale of Annie Palmer, we see Palmer subverting gender, religious, and class boundaries, among others, of course. So it might be interesting for us to think about the social norms presented in this tale, and of course in the others. The second is character development. There's a couple of really small changes that Brown makes, small but substantial. So in the previous versions, Annie always had somebody helping her kill her husband. But in this one, she acts alone. So that's an important distinction to make. And then another one, in the previous iterations, the enslaved people play relatively minor roles, but in this short story, even in these 6 pages, we see Brown centering their knowledge and their wisdom through lines such as, they said she was dangerous and they called her a witch and a devil. So we see them making an impression on us as readers. So it'd be interesting to think about why Brown made those updates. And finally, just to think about the larger function of the tale, I hate to tell you this, but it's actually probably fabricated. Historians have yet to find any evidence that points Annie Palmer to any crime or form of debauchery. Instead, evidence shows that John and Annie were a happily married couple, and that Annie died and was buried years after she was supposedly strangled or murdered. So it's just interesting to think about what's at stake in maintaining this legend of the White Witch of Rose Hall. Thank you very much. And I think we'll be setting up for the Q&A, so please submit your questions if you have any.
All right, well, thank you so much for each of our 4 panelists and interesting, fascinating stories. We do have a few submitted questions. I'll start with one. It's addressed to Professor Park, but I'll sort of add some bit at the end that can make it applicable for everybody. They said the last example of the translation of the Odyssey was indeed striking. How does each translation work to show and or obscure the broader cultural context of the Odyssey? And for the other panelists, any examples that you can think of that show kind of a similar way in which a translation might reveal or obscure some broader cultural implications?
This is working. Okay. That's a really easy question to answer. Okay, so I will say, speaking to Dr. Wilson's translation specifically, that she specifically kind of set out to write a feminist translation, but she is like a trained classicist, you know, with excellent Latin and Greek and everything. So I guess the the previous translations in English were all by men. But I guess the difference is, I mean, that's an obvious difference, but the difference is that those translators, I don't think, were consciously translating as men. Whereas Dr. Wilson was consciously translating as a woman. And, you know, her job, or the job she set out to do, was to bring out her interpretation of the Greek through a close reading of the Greek, right? But also to bring an interpretation that contrasted with what came before it, right? So I guess I guess the main difference is that she was very conscious of gender and her own gender identity and how it affects the translation. But I'm sure there are other, like, do you want to speak to translation? Oh, wait, there's, yeah.
Is this okay? It's on. No, thank you, whoever asked the question about translation. That's great. So in my presentation, I referenced a couple of different translations that I was using, mainly the Steptoe translation, which is actually the only published translation in English that's present, and then my own kind of, you know, translation of one of the manuscript variants. And particularly in a text like Erauso's, a kind of general reader translation, like the Steptoe translation, tends to collapse a lot of the nuance of the text. It doesn't register those moments, for example, you know, where there are variants across not only the two A and C manuscripts that I referenced, but also later 19th century versions of the text. So yeah, you know, when you translate something, you're always making a choice, right? Whether to privilege readability or whether to privilege accuracy. So, you know, where you land on that spectrum, the end result will be a different text, ultimately.
Okay, so for Japanese pre-modern Japanese text, the I introduced was from like 1960, and I didn't see many genders not gender gap, but most of those pre-modern literature translation that I deal with usually come from like 1945, 1960. Around that times, you know, there are a lot of kind of orientalizing kind of sentiment there. So sometimes the translators are trying to make it too foreign, so that, you know, kind of make it more exotic in a way. And that's problematic as it is. So for that, there is no gender issue, men's and then, you know, or even emperors or those Japanese old people are all victimized of those exotic kind of gaze. Also that sometimes they trying to make it too westernized language and then make too accessible to the Western audiences. So we don't have much, you know, better translation currently right now. So the one that I introduced was based on translation, and I added a little bit to kind of more nuance and edited. But that's my field currently, fortunately.
And I think in my case, to Dr. Harden's point about you know, audience and changes, I think the example from Brown's story that stands out to me is Annie growing tired of the men that she spends time with, right? I think we can all understand what was happening there. And of course, she's writing for a children's audience, so she had to adapt the tale for that purpose.
Here's another question that's sort of out to any and all of you. There's a great time span in the stories that you presented tonight. Does originating in the oral tradition give a story any sort of difference in a potential to transform versus existing in documents that scholars can trace?
So the question is, does originating in the oral tradition make a difference? Yes, of course it does. So in the specific case of Homer's Odyssey, we attach the name Homer to it, but Homer is just kind of a construct. There's no single author of the Odyssey. So nobody owns the story, right? I mean, the ancient Greeks own the story, or like the culture owns the story. But that gives a lot of freedom for adaptation without, I would think without accusations of quote unquote ruining the story. But I will also say that there are some who treat Homer as if it's almost like sacred text. So, but I personally think that oral tradition gives freedom to, for the story to evolve or to be adapted or transformed, either intentionally or unintentionally.
So in the specific case of Erauso's text, it's really interesting to think about an oral versus a written origin, right? When we think of autobiography, we think of someone actually sitting down to write out the story of their life. In the time in which she lived, you had people who did that, but you also had people who would narrate their life, right? In different kind of bureaucratic, sometimes inquisitional contexts, legal contexts, right? Confessional, religious contexts. And so it's actually kind of a debate to what extent Erauso wrote the text or, dictated it, and what difference that makes. And I think at the end of the day, in terms of her ownership of that text, I think that we can kind of deduce from the portrait she sat for, the interviews that she granted, her kind of desire to be in the public sphere, when she very easily could have, not granted those interviews, not sat for those portraits. I think we can see her active hand in sort of shaping her story. So whether that was through dictation or whether it was actually through writing, it doesn't really make that much of a difference, I would say.
In general, when I'm reading or talk about pre-modern Japanese literature, it's always some oral and the copying variants. The issue that many scholars cannot kind of emphasize the differences in each text, and then how they kind of copying from oral or read aloud together. But today, what I basically introduced you today was historical record. So in a way that this is slightly different category that people are probably trying to more accurately, the using writing system and then depict it. But I want to say one thing is that this even historical record, this is very interesting that kind of depicts, includes a lot of variants, even like 8th century. So it was not just a story that the emperor or the conquering story. So after that, the main text, many other kind of variant story are also included. So in a way, we could also interpret it that that's all domestication of the variants. We're all trying to legitimize. But this is again that the historical record basically in a way that trying to legitimize their kind of the authority. So it's slightly different genre that I was using today.
There's also a good bit of variance in the legend of Annie Palmer. So far we have 3 novels, a short story, and then a pamphlet. If you want to learn more, you can even watch an episode of Ghost Hunters International. So the story, yeah, I know, right? The story has really kind of like grown legs of its own. In some of them, she murders 3 husbands, some of them 5, sometimes there's children. It just really depends on who's telling the story and what they want to communicate.
I think we got about time for about one more. I think we're well past an hour now. But in some of the examples you gave, stories were manipulated to serve political purposes and sway public opinion. What does that aspect reveal about the power of narrative?
How long did we say we had? No, I'm just kidding. I mean, narrative is everything, right? It is what imposes meaning on the formlessness of experience, which is what autobiography is all about, right? Taking experience that could be sort of told or retold in any kind of sequence with any kind of emphasis and imposing a particular pattern upon it. So in the case of Erauso's text, I mean, people have received that text in very different ways, right? From, its earliest, from its earliest circulation, her story was seen as kind of this almost quasi-miraculous tale that had everything to do with Spanish imperial exceptionalism, et cetera, right? That's not very appealing to us now for obvious reasons. And there have been, different communities of readers who find different points of connection with that text. I think most recently people have read that text as kind of, the work of a transgender ancestor, right? Someone who used medical means. Didn't get to talk about this in the presentation, but according to an interview she granted to Pedro del Valle, Erauso explained how she had taken a particular medicine that had caused particular biological changes that had allowed her to live as a man. And I'm sorry I'm using the feminine form here. I do that because my exposure to the text is through this text that's titled, under the name La Monja Alferez, right? Catalina de Erauso. But all that to say that there's a lot of different ways you can read any text, and particularly one that has to do with transformation and possibility.
I think in the case of Annie Palmer, her tale has been linked to tourism and has been manipulated for that purpose. That's why I mentioned if you fly into Montego Bay, every tour pretty much will point out her home. You can go, you can tour the grounds, you can even host your wedding there. It's a common thing now to have your wedding there. It's really kind of actually gross. I didn't want to show you those images. But yeah, I mean, she was even at one point called a national treasure by the prime minister. So it's just kind of interesting to think about how her reputation is being used and is linked to tourism.
Okay, so I use a historical text, and then yes, indeed, that those stories are used for political purpose, but also the history use the story to tell tell the story. So one thing that I kind of wanted to challenge today was what's history, right? That word itself actually includes a story about it. So it's itself is also very interesting that what we should talk about the history is what without story there is no history, right? And then also that as I show the last kind of it becoming kind of escaping the monsters figure that was supposed to be the victim who were killed, but they become more popular than the original hero. So it's kind of the story is not is kind of become more lively, and then of course the leader it has many ways that they interpret it, and then they outlive as a form of story or monster that I love.
Well, thanks everybody for such a wonderful presentation tonight. And let's have another big round of applause for our faculty presenters. And the humanitiesfestival.arizona.edu will list the remainder of the events. We'll be back here next week for 2 events. Thank you.